In the winter of 1832, a fur trapper 1,000 miles from the nearest settlement would eat things that could clear a modern dinner table in seconds. Raw liver, still warm from the kill, intestines roasted over the coals without a rinse, fat scraped from inside a hide and spread like butter. To the mountain men of the American West, none of this was savagery. It was survival, and some of it was a delicacy worth riding days to taste. These were men who walked into the Rockies with a rifle, a knife, and little else, then lived for years on whatever the land gave up. The meals that kept them alive would turn most stomachs today. Number 2 was eaten half raw and scalding. Number 1 was a trapper's idea of heaven. Let's count down 25 vanished mountain man recipes too savage for the modern stomach. Number 25. Hardtack was the iron ration of every man who pushed past the edge of the map. Flour, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt, baked until it rang like a stone when struck. It kept for months, even years, in a saddlebag soaked by river crossings and baked by prairie sun. The trade-off was a biscuit that could crack a tooth left whole. Trappers learned to break it with a rifle butt, then soak the shards in hot coffee or stew until they swelled soft. Weevils were so common that men ate in the dark and called the extra protein a fair bargain. A simple thing, cheap to make, and nearly impossible to ruin, hardtack asked nothing of a man but patience and a strong jaw. It fed the long marches that built the fur trade, then vanished the moment fresh bread came west. Number 24. Cush turned a fistful of cornmeal into a meal a man could cook over a single fire. Cold cornbread or plain meal was crumbled into a skillet, sizzling with bacon grease or bear fat, then fried and stirred until it browned into a dense, savory hash. Sometimes water or coffee was poured in to bind it, sometimes a wild onion if the land offered one. It cost almost nothing and filled a belly fast, which is why it followed the long hunters and trappers across every ridge and valley. The smell of meal frying and hot grease meant the day's walking was done and the fire would burn a while longer. Children raised on the frontier knew Cush before they knew bread from a bakery. As stoves and store-bought loaves spread west, the skillet hash faded into a memory of leaner, hungrier days. Number 23. Cracklings were the crisp reward of a hard day's rendering. When a hog or a bear was killed, every scrap of fat was cut away and set to melt slowly in a great kettle. The liquid grease was poured off and stored for cooking in lamps. What remained were the browned, shrunken bits of skin and tissue, salted while hot and eaten by the handful. They were greasy, intensely rich, and almost unbearably savory, the kind of food a man craved after weeks of lean meat. Trappers tucked them into cornbread or simply chewed them around the fire, savoring fat that the body desperately needed in the cold. Nothing of the animal was wasted, and the cracklings were the cook's quiet wage for the labor. Today, we trim fat away and throw it out. The frontier saw it as one of the best parts of the kill. Number 22. Salt pork was the meat that traveled when no fresh meat could. Slabs of fatty pork were packed in barrels of salt brine that drew out the moisture and held off rot for months on the trail. Before eating, a man soaked the pork in stream water to leach out the worst of the salt, then fried it hard or boiled it with beans and meal. The fat that rendered out became the grease that cooked everything else, so a single slab earned its keep twice over. It was salty enough to make a man dream of fresh water, yet it carried trappers and pioneers across deserts and mountains where game was scarce. Cheap, durable, and endlessly useful, salt pork was the backbone of the trail kitchen. Refrigeration and the cattle drives finally ended its reign, but for decades it was survival in a barrel. Number 21. Fried squirrel filled the pot when bigger game stayed hidden in the timber. A frontier family or a lone trapper could bring down half a dozen in a morning, skin them quick, and have them spitting in a hot skillet by noon. The meat was lean and dark, the legs prized for their sweetness, and nothing was thrown away. The bolder cooks split the small skull and ate the brain, considered a delicacy by men who could not afford to waste a bite. Squirrel went into Brunswick stew with corn and beans, or was simply fried in grease and served with biscuits to mop the pan. It tasted of the forest, gamey and rich. To a modern table, the idea of eating the brain seems shocking, but on the frontier, it was simply respect for an animal that had given up its life to feed you. Number 20. Baked possum carried a reputation as the fattest, richest meat the southern frontier could offer. Hunters caught the slow-moving animal at night, often fattening it for days on scraps before the kill to sweeten the flesh. It was cleaned, parboiled to render some of its heavy grease, then baked surrounded by sweet potatoes that soaked up the drippings until they glistened. The result was greasy, dense, and powerfully flavored, a feast for families who saw fat as wealth. Around the cabin fire, possum and sweet potatoes meant a good night, a full plate after weeks of thin fare. The animal's appearance and its scavenging habits make most modern eaters recoil, but on the frontier, those same traits made it reliable and abundant. As stores and packaged meat reached the backcountry, the midnight possum hunt slipped quietly out of the American kitchen. Number 19. Roast raccoon was the bolder cousin of the possum, a meat that demanded careful handling to taste right. The hunter removed the scent glands first, then parboiled the carcass to draw out the strong, musky grease before it ever met the fire. Slow roasting with onions and a little vinegar tamed the wildness and left dark, tender meat that fell from the bone. On the frontier, a fat coon taken in autumn was prized. Its layer of fall fat, a sign of a hard winter, survived. Families served it at gatherings, and some communities built whole suppers around it. The labor of cleaning it properly and the gaminess that lingered if a cook grew careless made raccoon a dish that separated the skilled from the squeamish. Today the animal is seen only as a pest, but it once anchored many a frontier table. Number 18, groundhog or woodchuck, was the burrowing meal that fed the hill country when little else moved. Trappers and farmers dug or shot the heavy rodent from its tunnels, valuing the thick layer of fat it carried before its winter sleep. The trick was in the cleaning, for careless preparation left a strong, earthy taste that no amount of fire could hide. Skilled cooks removed the glands, soaked the meat in salted water overnight, then braised it slow with onions until it turned tender and surprisingly mild. The fat was rendered separately and saved like any other grease. To families scraping a living from rocky ground, a fat groundhog was a windfall, not a curiosity. The thought of digging dinner out of a hole strikes us as desperate now, but the frontier counted any reliable meat as a blessing worth the work. Number 17. Porcupine held a strange place of honor among men deep in the wilderness, for it was the one animal a starving, weaponless trapper could kill with a stick. Slow and clumsy, it could be brought down when a man had lost his rifle or his last shot, which made it a creature no mountain man would harm without need. The meat beneath the quills was fatty and tender, often roasted whole over the coals after the spines were singed away. It tasted faintly of pine and bark, a little sweet, the flavor coming from the animal's diet of tree bark and cambium. To eat porcupine was usually to admit hard times had arrived, yet the meat itself was genuinely good. The frontier respected it as an insurance policy with legs. Modern hunters pass it by entirely, never knowing it once stood between men and starvation. Number 16, rattlesnake was the meat that tested a man's nerve before it ever reached the fire. Killed and beheaded with care, the snake was skinned, gutted, and cut into sections that curled as they cooked over the coals. The flesh was pale and threaded with fine bones, the flavor mild and clean, often compared to fish or fowl by the men who ate it. On the dry plains and in the desert canyons, where larger game thinned out, a fat rattler was a meal a trapper would not refuse. Some cooked it in a stew to free the meat from the bones, others simply roasted it on a stick. There was a grim pride in turning a creature that could kill you into supper. We shudder at the idea today, but to men who lived among the snakes, eating one was only fair. Number 15. Beaver tail was the delicacy that turned a working animal into a feast. The beaver itself was the trapper's living, its pelt the currency of the entire mountain trade, but the broad, scaly tail was the cook's secret reward. Held over a fire until the rough skin blistered and peeled away, it revealed a layer of pure gelatinous fat beneath, rich and buttery, and prized above almost any other morsel in camp. Men who lived on lean meat for weeks craved that fat the way others crave sweets. Roasted slow or boiled into soup, the tail was shared around the fire as a treat earned by a good day's trapping. It was the one part of the beaver worth more at the table than on the stretching frame. When the beaver trade collapsed, this strange luxury vanished with it. Number 14. Bear meat and bear grease were the dark, heavy bounty of a dangerous kill. The flesh was strong and rich, closer to pork than to venison, but it was the fat that trappers valued most. Rendered slowly into a clear golden oil, bear grease became the finest cooking fat a man could carry, prized for frying, for waterproofing leather, and for soothing cracked hands in the cold. A single fat bear, taken in the fall, could supply a camp for weeks. The meat fed the men, the oil greased their kitchens and their gear, and nothing went to waste. There was real danger in earning it, which only made the feast that followed sweeter. As farms and stores spread across the West, the great bears were hunted out and bear oil disappeared from the pantry, replaced by lard and store-bought tins. Number 13. Panther meat, taken from the cougar that haunted the high country, was a dish few admitted to enjoying, and many secretly did. Trappers and long hunters who killed the big cat to protect their camps often found the pale meat surprisingly fine, lean and tender, compared by more than one to veal or young pork. The taboo was social, not culinary. To eat a predator felt wrong to some and like a triumph to others. Cooked slow with whatever herbs the land offered, panther-fed men who had stared down one of the wilderness's deadliest hunters and come out ahead. The act carried a quiet bravado, a way of claiming the mountain itself. As settlement pushed the great cats into the remotest ranges, the chance to taste one all but disappeared, and the dish survives now only in old hunters' tales. Number 12. Buffalo tongue was the choicest cut on the entire plains, a delicacy so prized it eventually became a trade good all its own. When the great herds were taken, the tongue was cut out first, smoked or boiled until it turned tender and faintly sweet, richer than any other part of the animal. Mountain men feasted on it fresh at the kill, savoring a cut that fetched high prices back east, where city tables paid dearly for what trappers ate around a campfire. The contrast was stark. A luxury for the wealthy was simply Tuesday's supper in the mountains. The tongue's fame, however, drove a slaughter that helped empty the plains, as hunters took the prized cut and left much of the rest behind. When the herds vanished, so did the casual feasts. What was once common is now nearly unknown. Number 11. Hump ribs were the trapper's idea of a Sunday roast, cut from the great muscled rise along a buffalo's spine. The hump carried a marbled, fat meat, unlike anything on a domestic animal, and the ribs that supported it were roasted whole over open coals until the fat crackled and dripped into the flames. Men who had eaten lean for weeks would gather close, knives out, carving straight from the bone. Accounts from the rendezvous describe trappers eating astonishing quantities in a single sitting, the body demanding the fat, that the mountains so often denied it. The hump was the centerpiece of any good buffalo feast, the proof of a successful hunt. As the herds were destroyed and the open range fenced, this towering cut of meat simply ceased to exist. No domestic animal carries its like today. Number 10, jerky was the survival skill that turned a fresh kill into months of food. Thin strips of lean meat, usually buffalo or venison, were hung on wooden racks in the sun and wind, or smoked slowly over a low fire until every drop of moisture was gone. What remained was hard, dark, and nearly weightless, able to ride in a rawhide bag or saddlebag for a season without spoiling. A trapper could chew it on the move, soak it into a stew at night, or pound it into the foundation of richer dishes. The technique came from the Plains tribes, who had perfected it over centuries, and the mountain men adopted it wholesale because their lives depended on it. Jerky survives on store shelves today, sweetened and softened beyond recognition. The hard, plain trail meat that kept men alive is a different thing entirely. Number 9. Pemmican was the legendary survival food of the West, a frontier invention so efficient that armies and explorers later copied it. Lean meat was dried hard, then pounded to a coarse powder and mixed with an equal weight of melted fat, sometimes with dried berries crushed in for flavor and to ward off sickness. Packed into rawhide bags and sealed with tallow, it kept for years through heat, cold, and damp. A few ounces carried more energy than pounds of fresh meat, making it the perfect ration for men crossing country where the next meal was never certain. Dense, greasy, and powerfully filling, it was eaten raw or boiled into a stew the brigades called rubaboo. Learned from the tribes and the fur companies, pemmican was the food that made long expeditions possible. Modern eaters find its fatty intensity overwhelming, but to a trapper, it was nothing less than life itself. Number 8, dipouille was the prized strip of fat that mountain men treated almost like candy. Cut from along the buffalo's backbone, this thick layer of back fat was dipped briefly in hot grease or boiling water to set it, then hung to dry until it firmed into something between bacon and butter. Trappers carried it as a luxury and ate it in slices laid over lean meat, or simply on its own, savoring fat the way others savored sweets. After weeks of stringy game, the body screamed for it, and dipouille answered. It was rich enough to make a modern eater wince, the picture of a man eating fat by the strip with evident delight. Yet it was exactly what the cold, hard-working frontier demanded. Bound entirely to the buffalo and the trade that hunted them, dipouille disappeared the moment the herds were gone. Number 7, head cheese, also called souse, was the frontier's way of honoring an old promise that nothing be wasted. The head of a hog or large game animal was simmered for hours until the meat fell from the bone. Then the picked flesh was seasoned with salt, pepper, and vinegar and pressed into a mold to set in its own natural jelly. Sliced cold, it was a trembling loaf of meat and gelatin, served on bread with mustard or pickles. The name unsettles people now, and the sight of it sets modern stomachs turning. But on the frontier, it was thrift made delicious. Every part of a slaughtered animal carried value, and the head, so often discarded today, became a centerpiece. As butcher shops and packaged meat reached the back country, the patient labor of souse making faded, and with it, a dish that once defined a careful kitchen. Number 6, bone marrow earned the affectionate name trapper's butter, and few prizes in camp were sweeter. After a kill, the long leg bones were thrown into the fire or cracked open and roasted until the marrow inside softened to a rich golden paste. Spread on hardtack or eaten straight from the bone with the point of a knife, it was buttery, nourishing, and deeply satisfying to men starved of fat. The marrow gut, a fatty section of the intestine, was treated as a related delicacy and roasted the same way. Trappers competed for the best bones the way others fight over dessert. The body craved exactly what marrow offered, and the frontier delivered it without ceremony. We pay restaurant prices for roasted marrow today and call it refined. The mountain men simply called it supper and cracked another bone. Number 5. Rocky Mountain oysters were the frontier delicacy whose cheerful name fooled no one for long. Taken from young buffalo, bulls, or other game at slaughter, the testicles were peeled of their tough outer membrane, sliced and fried in hot grease until golden and crisp. The meat inside was tender and mild, and to men who wasted nothing, it was a genuine treat rather than a dare. The evasive name grew up around the dish precisely because plain speaking made polite company uneasy. On the range and at the trail's end, though, no one apologized for the feast. It was simply more food the animal had provided, and refusing it would have seemed foolish. The dish survives in pockets of cattle country to this day, but most modern eaters meet it only as a punchline, never guessing it once nourished the men who opened the West. Number 4. Buffalo blood was the meal that turned the very life of the animal into food. At a fresh kill, trappers in the tribes they learned from caught the warm blood and thickened it with marrow, fat, and a little meal or crushed jerky, then warmed it gently into a dark, rich pudding or soup. Nothing was more efficient, for the blood carried iron, salt, and nourishment that lean wilderness meat often lacked. To men whose bodies were stretched thin by cold and labor, it was medicine as much as a meal. The practice came straight from the Plains peoples, who had built whole traditions on using every part of the buffalo. The sight and idea of it stop a modern eater cold, but on the frontier, to waste the blood was to waste the kill, and that was a sin no hungry trapper could afford. Number 3. Brains were eaten with a directness that unsettles us now, roasted right in the cracked skull at the edge of the fire. To the mountain men, they were a soft, rich delicacy, and the same brains that fed the camp also tanned the hides that clothed it, for the Plains method of softening leather used the animal's own brain matter. A successful hunt thus gave twice over supper and the means to make buckskin. Eaten warm with a little salt, the brains were creamy and mild, a prize claimed quickly before anyone else could reach them. There was an old wilderness saying that every animal carried just enough brains to tan its own hide, and the trappers lived by it. The modern stomach turns at the thought entirely. On the frontier, it was simply good sense, good leather, and a good meal all at once. Number 2. Boudins were the buffalo dish that defined the mountain man feast, and the one most likely to empty a modern table. A length of the animal's small intestine was taken fresh at the kill, and rather than being emptied and scrubbed, it was roasted over the coals much as it came, the contents cooking inside it into a rich, savory filling. Trappers prized it above almost everything, eating it half raw and scalding hot, the grease running down their hands as they passed it around the fire. Accounts from the rendezvous describe grown men fighting good-naturedly over the best lengths, eating until they could barely move. It was the ultimate expression of a culture that wasted nothing and craved fat above all. The very thought repels us now. To the mountain men, a fresh boudin straight off the coals was the finest thing the Plains could give. Number 1. And at the top of the list, raw, warm liver eaten at the kill stood as the truest emblem of the mountain man's world. The moment a buffalo fell, the trappers opened it, lifted out the steaming liver, and ate it on the spot, raw and still warm, often dipped in the bitter green bile of the gallbladder for seasoning. To men starved of fresh food for weeks or months, nothing tasted better, and the body, deprived of vitamins on a diet of dried and lean meat, craved exactly what the raw organ provided. The practice came from the Plains tribes, who had long understood its value, and the mountain men embraced it without hesitation. It was survival distilled to its rawest form, a meal taken before the animal had even cooled. The modern stomach recoils completely. But to the men who lived and died in the high country, this was the feast that meant they would live another season. These 25 recipes belonged to a vanished world, one where a knife, a rifle, and the land were all a man had between himself and starvation. The mountain men ate this way because the wilderness allowed nothing else, and in their hunger, they found delicacies we can no longer stomach. When the beaver trade collapsed and the great herds were gone, their savage kitchen vanished with them. What seems unthinkable to us was to them simply the taste of staying alive. So which one could you have eaten? Let me know in the comments.